in terms of monitoring, what we want to know is what else do we need to understand in order to make sense of this editorial? And there are a couple things in here. You know, for example, when it talks about Judge Jones put on the federal bench in Alabama, when it talks about the children at Oyster Bay going up San Juan Hill, these are kind of specific historical references which at the time would have made sense to people and to a historian would be, you know, they probably would know about what they are, but I would want to know more about each of these specific examples in order to understand not only how they're being used here, but also whether or not they matter. Okay, so these are kind of specific things that you could go out and do some more research on, find out from the newspapers at the time, you know, read a biography of Roosevelt, you know, understand more about electoral politics, federal politics in the South, to see whether or not these things are significant, whether they change the interpretation of this document. The other obvious question in terms of monitoring this, in terms of what else you want to know, is what were the attitudes of readers? Okay, what were the attitudes in Richmond, in Virginia, in the U.S. South on these questions? You know, was this a situation where the newspaper editorial is very reflective of these views and it really is kind of in the mainstream, or were the editorial writers somehow even kind of more adamant in their support of segregation than was the public opinion, and that the editors were trying very hard to change people's attitudes in order to make them more critical of Theodore Roosevelt, or the opposite? You know, was public opinion actually strongly in support of segregation, and if anything, this kind of indirect language was softer, was milder than what would have been public opinion. So in any time you're reading a newspaper article, and particularly an editorial, you want to figure out some way to compare what's being said in the newspaper with what people actually believe. Of course, when you talk about anything having to do with race in the U.S. South, you want to distinguish between kind of white opinion and African American opinion on these kinds of public issues. This editorial was written by white editors. This is a white newspaper. It's written overwhelmingly for a white audience. African Americans may have read this newspaper, but it's very unlikely they would have identified with or agreed with this editorial. And so one way we want to monitor this, first of all, is very much remembering that public opinion is not uniform in this community, but also we could compare this to African American newspapers. And of course, one of the most influential in all of the U.S. South was being published in the same city, the Richmond Planet, and so it would be really interesting in terms of evaluating this editorial to compare it to what was being written in the Richmond Planet at the same time and on exactly the same question. So this gives us a way to kind of make these comparisons. And finally, the other question you would want to ask is, you know, what's changing over time? You know, what is it about this dinner in October 1901 that triggers this much attention? Our attitudes towards race and segregation, you know, the editorial makes it sound like we've always believed this. Well, we know that isn't true. You know, that attitudes towards segregation change over time. And so is this a high point in terms of defending segregation? Is this a time when segregation seems under attack, and so the editorial editors feel like they have to make a really strong statement? Is this a time when, you know, kind of white opinion was very kind of consistent and uniform on this, and so the editors could safely say, this is, you know, what we all believe, and this is why we're so unhappy with this dinner? And so part of this has to do with understanding change over time, and the ways that attitudes may, you know, get stronger or get weaker depending on what other kinds of things are going on. So these are all ways where, in terms of situating this editorial, in terms of these longer patterns, you would want to ask either specific questions about individual examples, or understand more generally the relationship between an editorial and the kind of response of readers and how they felt about these questions more generally. Okay?